Welcome. Atheist, agnostic, skeptic, whatever you like to call yourself, you are welcome here. At Seattle Atheist Church, we call ourselves an atheist church because you will never hear anything supernatural promoted from the podium. This is our creed. Seattle Atheist Church was founded on the principles of scientific naturalism and secular ethics. Truth claims are attempted here, and we stand ready to revise our thinking in light of new information. We try to be excellent to all conscious beings, and we believe in good, because good works in non-mysterious ways. If that sounds right to you, then you are probably in the right place. So today after church at 3 o'clock at the Wayward Coffee House on 65th and Roosevelt, there will be board games if anybody would like to join us for board games. And then next Saturday, is it at 2 o'clock or 3 o'clock?
One of those.
Okay, check the website because I think we moved it up earlier.
I think it's 3 o'clock.
It's 3 o'clock. We moved it later so we could get some happy hour prices on snacks. We're going to be meeting at Browers, spelled Brouwers, Browers Cafe in Fremont. Please come out and join us for a drink, and they also have non-alcoholic drinks. So everyone is welcome, but it is 21 and older, that one. So anyway, the way this works is the members ourselves give the talks, and then we will have a discussion afterwards. So today we've got a talk on reparations by Jack. Let's get started.
Hi everyone. Before I get started, I wanted to say that if you find these talks valuable and you enjoy the group discussion afterwards, as I do, then please consider donating to support us. Your donations allow us to rent the room, provide refreshments, and continue to foster the community that we have grown here. It takes 23 people donating $5 each week for us to break even, and any shortage is covered out of pocket by Troy and I and the Walters. Of course, we'd love to do better than break even, so we can start building up a surplus that will let us have a presence at community events throughout the year, like the Pride Parade and various street fairs. Another way you can contribute is to invite your friends and family. If you know someone who you think would enjoy what we do here, invite them along. If there's someone from church you haven't seen in a while, reach out to them and catch up. Our group discussion gets even more valuable as we hear from more group perspectives. Okay, on with today's talk. All right, so as you may know, February is Black History Month, and as you may also know, Black history is American history. But observing Black History Month in the month of February gives us a chance to focus on a part of our shared history that the founder, Carter G. Woodson, observed was at risk of disappearing. Woodson was the son of former slaves who became a Harvard-educated scholar and worked to broaden everyone's understandings of the contributions of African Americans, because he felt that without access to broader information, students and teachers would become victims of selfish propaganda. So today I wanted to talk to you about Ta-Nehisi Coates' cover article in The Atlantic called "The Case for Reparations." But first I want to get a feel for the prevailing sentiment in the room. By a show of hands, who supports reparations? By whatever you understand that to mean. Okay. And who opposes reparations? Okay. And who's not sure? All right. Thanks. So I wanted to talk to you today about the case for reparations. The title caught my eye a few years ago and stuck in my mind. It's a really long article, as the cover articles for The Atlantic tend to be. So it was quite a while before I finally got to it. I'd always dismissed reparations as being about, just a bunch of whiny people looking for any excuse to get a handout. I don't harbor any hatred or ill will towards black people in my heart, and slavery was a terrible atrocity, but look, it's been over 150 years since the end of slavery. Why haven't they been able to work hard and get over it by now? Recognizing that my position was based in ignorance, I wanted to get some exposure to some quality intellectual arguments for reparations to challenge my perspective. And boy, did Ta-Nehisi Coates deliver. Why indeed? This article explains why. I'd love to read the whole thing here for you, because I think everyone should read it, but the speech timing estimator that I use estimates that reading all 15,000 plus words would take about over an hour and a half, which sounds absolutely exhausting, and probably would become unbearable for you. So I'll just present some select passages and minor commentary. All right, here we go. Coates begins by introducing Clyde Ross. Clyde Ross was born in 1923, the seventh of 13 children, near Clarksdale, Mississippi, the home of the blues. Ross's parents owned and farmed a 40-acre tract of land, flush with cows, hogs, and mules. The Ross family wanted for little, save that which all black families in the Deep South then desperately desired, the protection of the law. In the 1920s, Jim Crow Mississippi was, in all facets of society, a kleptocracy. The majority of the people in the state were perpetually robbed of the vote, a hijacking engineered through the trickery of the poll tax and the muscle of the lynch mob. Between 1882 and 1968, more black people were lynched in Mississippi than in any other state. You and I know what's the best way to keep the black man from voting, blustered Theodore Bilbo, a Mississippi senator and proud Klansman. You do it the night before the election. That state's regime partnered robbery of the franchise with robbery of the purse. Many of Mississippi's black farmers lived in debt peonage, under the sway of cotton kings who were at once their landlords, their employers, and their primary merchants. Tools and necessities were bought on credit against the return on the crop, which was determined by the employer. When farmers were deemed to be in debt, and they often were, the negative balance was then carried over to the next season. A man or woman who protested this arrangement did so at the risk of grave injury or death. Refusing to work meant arrest under the state's vagrancy laws and forced labor under the state's penal system. Well into the 20th century, black people spoke of their flight from Mississippi in much the same manner that their renegade ancestors had. In her 2010 book, The Warmth of Other Suns, Isabel Wilkerson tells the story of Eddie Urban, a spinach picker who fled Mississippi in 1963 after being made to work at gunpoint. He didn't talk about it or tell nobody, Urban said. You had to sneak away. When Clyde Ross was still a child, Mississippi authorities claimed his father owed $3,000 in back taxes. The elder Ross could not read. He did not have a lawyer. He did not know anyone at the local courthouse. He could not expect the police to be impartial. Effectively, the Ross family had no way to contest the claim and no protection under the law. The authorities seized the land. They seized the buggy. They took the cows, hogs, and mules. And so, for the upkeep of separate but equal, the entire Ross family was reduced to sharecropping. This was hardly unusual. In 2001, the Associated Press published a 3-part investigation into the theft of black-owned land stretching back into the antebellum period. The series documented some 406 victims and 24,000 acres of land, valued at tens of millions of dollars. The land was taken through means ranging from legal chicanery to terrorism. Some of the land taken from black families has become a country club in Virginia, the AP reported, as well as oil fields in Mississippi and a baseball spring training facility in Florida. The losses mounted. As sharecroppers, the Ross family saw their wages treated as the landlord's slush fund. Landowners were supposed to split the profits from the cotton fields with the sharecroppers, but bales would often disappear during the count, or the split might be altered on a whim. If cotton was selling for 50 cents a pound, the Ross family might get 15 cents, or only 5. One year, Ross's mother promised to buy him a $7 suit for a summer program at their church. She ordered the suit by mail. But that year, Ross's family was paid only 5 cents a pound for cotton. The mailman arrived with the suit. The Rosses could not pay. The suit was sent back. Clyde Ross did not go to the church choir. It was in these early years that Ross began to understand himself as an American. He did not live under the blind decree of justice, but under the heel of a regime that elevated armed robbery to a governing principle. He thought about fighting. "Just be quiet," his father told him, "because they'll come and kill us all." Clyde Ross grew. He was drafted into the Army. The draft officials offered him an exemption if he stayed home and worked. He preferred to take his chances with war. He was stationed in California. He found that he could go to stores without being bothered. He could walk the streets without being harassed. He could go into a restaurant and receive service. Ross was shipped off to Guam. He fought in World War II to save the world from tyranny. But when he returned to Clarksdale, he found that tyranny had followed him home. This was 1947, 8 years before Mississippi lynched Emmett Till and tossed his broken body into the Tallahatchie River. The Great Migration, a mass exodus of 6 million African Americans that spanned most of the 20th century, was now in its second wave. The Black Pilgrims did not journey north simply seeking better wages or work, or bright lights and big adventures. They were fleeing the inquisitive warlords of the South. They were seeking the protection of the law. Clyde Ross was among them. He came to Chicago in 1947 and took a job as a taster at Campbell's Soup. He made a stable wage. He married. He had children. His paycheck was his own. No Klansman stripped him of the vote. When he walked down the street, he did not have to move because a white man was walking past. He did not have to take off his hat or avert his gaze. His journey from peonage to full citizenship seemed near complete. Only one item was missing: a home. That final badge of entry into the sacred order of the American middle class of the Eisenhower years. In 1961, Ross and his wife bought a house in North Lawndale, a bustling community on Chicago's west side. North Lawndale had long been a predominantly Jewish neighborhood, but a handful of middle-class African Americans had lived there starting in the 40s. The community was anchored by the sprawling Sears Roebuck headquarters. North Lawndale's Jewish People's Institute actively encouraged blacks to move to the neighborhood, seeking to make it a pilot community for interracial living. In the battle for integration, then being fought around the country, North Lawndale seemed to offer promising terrain. But out in the tall grass, highwaymen, nefarious as any Clarksdale kleptocrat, were laying in wait. 3 months after Clyde Ross moved into his house, the boiler blew out. This would normally be a homeowner's responsibility, but in fact, Ross was not really a homeowner. His payments were made to the seller, not to the bank. And Ross had not signed a normal mortgage. He bought on contract, a predatory agreement that combined all the responsibilities of homeownership with all the disadvantages of renting and offered the benefits of neither. Ross had bought his house for $27,500. The seller, not the previous homeowner, but a new kind of middleman, had bought it for only $12,000 6 months before. In a contract sale, the seller kept the deed until the contract was paid in full. And unlike a normal mortgage, Ross would acquire no equity in the meantime. If he missed a single payment, he would immediately forfeit his $1,000 down payment, all his monthly payments, and the property itself. The men who peddled contracts in North Lawndale would sell homes at inflated prices and then evict families who could not pay, taking their down payment and their monthly installments as profit. Then they'd bring in another black family, rinse and repeat. He loads them up with payments they can't meet, an office secretary told the Chicago Daily News of her boss, the speculator Lou Fuchanis, in 1963. Then he takes the property away from them, He'd sold some of the buildings 3 or 4 times. Contract sellers used every tool in their disposal to pilfer from their clients. They scared white residents into selling low. They lied about property's compliance with building codes, then left the buyer responsible when the city inspectors arrived. They presented themselves as real estate brokers, when in fact they were the owners. They guided their clients to lawyers who were in on the scheme. So this was the first concept I wasn't aware of before reading the article, Buying Homes on Contract. How predatory and premeditated that was, and how vulnerable the victims were. But that made me wonder, why didn't he just get a proper mortgage and avoid all this nonsense? Coates explains, Ross had tried to get a legitimate mortgage in another neighborhood, but was told by the loan officer that there was no financing available. The truth was there was no financing available for people like Clyde Ross. From the 1930s through the 1960s, black people across the country were largely cut out of the legitimate home mortgage market through means both legal and extra-legal. Chicago whites employed every measure, from restrictive covenants to bombings, to keep their neighborhoods segregated. Their efforts were buttressed by the federal government. In 1934, Congress created the Federal Housing Administration. The FHA insured private mortgages, causing a drop in interest rates and a decline in the size of a down payment required to buy a house. But an insured mortgage was not a possibility for Clyde Ross. The FHA had adopted a system of maps that rated neighborhoods according to their perceived stability. On the maps, green areas rated A indicated in-demand neighborhoods that, as one appraiser put it, lacked a single foreigner or African American. These neighborhoods were considered excellent prospects for insurance. Neighborhoods where black people lived were rated D and were usually considered ineligible for FHA backing. They were colored in red. Neither the percentage of black people living there nor their social class mattered. Black people were viewed as a contagion. Redlining went beyond FHA-backed loans and spread to the entire mortgage industry, which was already rife with racism, excluding black people from most legitimate means of obtaining a mortgage. This is the second concept I wasn't aware of before reading the article, redlining. It had a massive widespread impact on the accumulated wealth of African Americans by limiting their access to one of the biggest and most common ways to build intergenerational wealth, home ownership. And that impact is felt in many ways, as we shall see. Coates continues, a government offering such bounty to builders and lenders could have required compliance with a non-discrimination policy, wrote Charles Abrams in 1955, the urban studies expert who helped create the New York City Housing Authority. Instead, the FHA adopted a racial policy that could well have been culled from the Nuremberg laws. The devastating effects are cogently outlined by Melvin, Oliver, and Thomas Shapiro in their 1995 book, Black Wealth, White Wealth. Locked out of the greatest mass-based opportunity for wealth accumulation in American history, African Americans who desired and were able to afford homeownership found themselves consigned to central city communities where their investments were affected by the self-fulfilling prophecies of the FHA appraisers. Cut off from sources of new investment, their homes and communities deteriorated and lost value in comparison to those homes and communities that the FHA appraisers deemed desirable. In Chicago and across the country, whites looking to achieve the American dream could rely on a legitimate credit system backed by the government. Blacks were herded into the sights of unscrupulous lenders who took them for money and for sport. One housing attorney told the historian Beryl Satter in her 2009 book, Family Properties, it was like people who like to go out and shoot lions in Africa. It was the same thrill of the chase and the kill. The kill, so to speak, was profitable. Contract sellers made much of their money by exploiting the frustrated hopes of black migrants like Clyde Ross. And it gets worse. In the aftermath of the Civil War, radical Republicans attempted to reconstruct the country upon something resembling universal equality. But they were beaten back by a campaign of redemption, led by white-liners, red shirts, and Klansmen bent on upholding a society formed for the white, not for the black man. A wave of terrorism roiled the South. Federal troops withdrew from the South in 1877. The dream of Reconstruction died. For the next century, political violence was visited upon blacks wantonly, with special treatment meted out towards black people of ambition. Black schools and churches were burned to the ground. Black voters and the political candidates who attempted to rally them were intimidated, and some of them were murdered. At the end of World War I, black veterans returning from to their homes were assaulted for daring to wear the American uniform. Fast forward to 1951, thousands of whites in Cicero, 20 minutes or so west of downtown Chicago, attacked an apartment building that housed a single black family, throwing bricks and firebombs through the windows and setting the apartment on fire. A Cook County grand jury declined to charge the rioters and instead indicted the family's NAACP attorney, the apartment's white owner, and the owner's attorney and rental agent, charging them with conspiring to lower property values. When terrorism ultimately failed, white homeowners simply fled the neighborhood. The traditional terminology, white flight, implies a kind of natural expression of preference. In fact, white flight was a triumph of social engineering, orchestrated by the shared racist presumptions of America's public and private sectors. For should any non-racist white families decide that integration might not be so bad as a matter of principle or of practice, they still had to contend with the hard facts of American housing policy. One man said his black neighbor was probably a nice guy, but every time I look at him, I see $2,000 drop off the value of my house. That's about $18,000 in today's dollars. He was not merely engaging in racist dogma. He was accurately observing the impact of federal policy on market prices. If black folks moved next door, housing policy almost guaranteed that their neighbors' property values would decline. Redlining destroyed the possibility of investment wherever black people lived. Speculators in North Lawndale and at the edge of the black ghettos knew there was money to be made off of white panic. They resorted to blockbusting, spooking whites into selling cheap before the neighborhood became black. They would hire a black woman to walk up and down the street with a stroller. Or they'd hire someone to call a number in the neighborhood looking for a Johnny May. Then they'd cajole whites into selling at low prices, informing them that the more blacks moved in, the more the value of their homes would decline, so better to sell now. With these white fled homes in hand, speculators then turned to the masses of black people that had streamed northward as part of the Great Migration, or who were desperate to escape the ghettos. Speculators would take the houses they'd just bought cheap through blockbusting and sell them to blacks on contract. Contract sellers became rich. North Lawndale became a ghetto. The New Deal is today remembered as a model for what progressive government should do. Cast a broad social safety net that protects the poor and the afflicted while building the middle class. When progressives wish to express their disappointment with Barack Obama, they point to the accomplishments of Franklin Roosevelt. But these progressives rarely note that Roosevelt's New Deal, much like the democracy that produced it, rested on the foundation of Jim Crow. The Jim Crow South was the one collaborator that America's democracy could not do without. Writes history and political science professor at Columbia. The marks of that collaboration are all over the New Deal. The omnibus programs passed under the Social Security Act in 1935 were crafted in such a way as to protect the Southern way of life. Old age insurance, Social Security proper, and unemployment insurance excluded farm workers and domestics, jobs heavily occupied by blacks. When President Roosevelt signed the Social Security into law in 1935, 65% of African Americans nationally, and between 70 and 80% in the South, were ineligible. The NAACP protested, calling the new American safety net a sieve with holes just big enough for the majority of black folks to fall through. The oft-celebrated GI Bill similarly failed black Americans by mirroring the broader country's insistence on racist housing policy. Though ostensibly colorblind, Title III of the bill, which aimed to give veterans access to low-interest home loans, left black veterans to tangle with white officials at the local Veterans Administration, as well as with the same banks that had for years refused to grant mortgages to blacks. The historian Kathleen J. Friedel observes in her 2009 book, The GI Bill, that so many blacks were disqualified from receiving Title III benefits that it's more accurate simply to say blacks could not use this particular title. The federal government is premised on equal fealty from all its citizens, who in return are to receive equal treatment. But as late as the mid-20th century, this bargain was not granted to black people, who repeatedly paid a higher price for citizenship and received less in return. Plunder had been the essential feature of slavery, but practically a full century after the end of the Civil War and the abolition of slavery, the plunder, quiet, systemic, and submerged, continued, even amidst the aims and achievements of New Deal liberals. While the people advocating reparations have changed over time, the response from the country has remained virtually the same. They have been taught to labor, the Chicago Tribune editorialized in 1891. They've been taught Christian civilization and to speak the noble English language instead of some African gibberish. The account is square with the ex-slaves. Not exactly. Having been enslaved for 250 years, black people were not left to their own devices. They were terrorized. In the Deep South, a second slavery ruled. In the North, legislatures, mayors, civic associations, banks, and citizens all colluded to pin black people into ghettos where they were overcrowded, overcharged, and undereducated. Businesses discriminated against them, awarding them the worst jobs and the worst wages. Police brutalized them into the streets. And the notion that black lives, black bodies, and black wealth were rightful targets remained deeply rooted in the broader society. Now we have half stepped away from our long centuries of despoilment, promising never again. But still we are haunted. It is as though we have run up a credit card bill and, having pledged to charge no more, remain befuddled that balance does not disappear. The effects of that balance, interest accruing daily, are all around us. Broach the topic of reparations today, and the barrage of questions inevitably follows. Who will be paid? How much will they be paid? And who will pay? But if the practicalities and not the justice of reparations are the true sticking point, there has for some time been the beginnings of a solution. For the past 25 years, Congressman John Conyers, Jr., who represents the Detroit area, has marked every session of Congress by introducing a bill calling for a congressional study of slavery and its lingering effects, as well as recommendations for appropriate remedies. A country curious about how reparations might actually work has an easy solution in Conyers' bill, now called H.R. 40, the Commission to Study the Reparations Proposals for African Americans Act. We would support this bill, submit the question to study, and then assess the possible solutions. But we are not interested. It's because it's black folks making the claim, says Ta-Nehisi, who helped found the National Coalition of Blacks for Reparations in America, or NCOBRA. People who talk about reparations are considered leftist lunatics, but all we're talking about is studying reparations. As John Conyers has said, we study everything. We study the water, we study the air. Why can't we even study this issue? This bill does not authorize 1 red cent to anyone. That H.R. 40 has never, under either Democrats nor Republicans, made it to the House floor suggests that our concerns are rooted not in the impracticality of reparations, but in something more existential. If we conclude that the conditions in North Lawndale and Black America are not inexplicable, but are instead precisely what you'd expect of a community that for centuries has lived in America's crosshairs, then what are we to make of the world's oldest democracy? One cannot escape the question by hand-waving at the past, disavowing the acts of one's ancestors, nor by citing a recent date of ancestral immigration. The last slaveholder has been dead for a very long time. The last soldier to endure Valley Forge has been dead much longer. To proudly claim the veteran and disown the slaveholder is patriotism a la carte. A nation outlives its generations. We were not there when Washington crossed the Delaware, but Emanuel Gottlieb Leutz's iconic painting of the scene has meaning to us. We were not there when Woodrow Wilson took us into World War I, but we are still paying out the pensions. If Thomas Jefferson's genius matters, then so does his taking of Sally Hemings' body. If George Washington crossing the Delaware matters, so must his ruthless pursuit of the renegade Oney Judge. Indeed, in America, there's a strange and powerful belief that if you stab a black person 10 times, the bleeding stops and the healing begins the moment the assailant drops the knife. We believe white dominance to be a fact of the inert past, a delinquent debt that can be made to disappear if only we don't look. Coates' words here evoke the sentiment of Malcolm X when he said, "If you stick a knife in my back 9 inches and pull it out 6 inches, that's not progress. If you pull it all the way out, that's not progress. The progress comes from healing the wound that the blow made." They haven't even begun to pull the knife out. They won't even admit the knife is there. Scholars have long discussed methods by which America might make reparations to those on whose labor and exclusion the country was built. In the 1970s, the Yale law professor Boris Bitker argued in The Case for Black Reparations that a rough price tag for reparations could be determined by multiplying the number of African Americans in the population by the difference in white and black per capita income. That number, $34 billion in 1973, when Bitker wrote his book, which equates to $187 billion in today's dollars, could be added to a reparations program each year for a decade or two. Teamwork. Today, Charles Ogletree, the Harvard Law School professor, argues for something broader, a program of job training in public works that takes racial justice as its mission, but includes the poor of all races. To celebrate freedom and democracy while forgetting America's origins in a slavery economy is patriotism a la carte. Perhaps no statistic better illustrates the enduring legacy of our country's shameful history of treating black people as sub-citizens, sub-Americans, and subhumans than the wealth gap. Reparations would seek to close this chasm, but as surely as the creation of the wealth gap require the cooperation of every aspect of society, bridging it will require the same. Perhaps after a serious discussion and debate, the kind that H.R. 40 proposes, we may find that the country can never fully repay African Americans. But we stand to discover much about ourselves in the process. And that is perhaps what scares us. The idea of reparations is frightening, not simply because we might lack the ability to pay. The idea of reparations threatens something much deeper: America's heritage, history, and standing in the world. The early American economy was built on slave labor. The Capitol and the White House were built by slaves. President James K. Polk traded slaves from the Oval Office. The laments about black mythology, criticism of black family structures by pundits and intellectuals ring hollow in a country whose existence was predicated on the torture of black fathers, the rape of black mothers, and the sale of black children. An honest assessment of America's relationship to the black family reveals the country to be not its nurturer, but its destroyer. And this destruction did not end with slavery. Discriminatory laws joined the equal burden of citizenship to unequal distribution of its bounty. These laws reached their apex in the mid-20th century when the federal government, through housing policies, engineered the wealth gap, which remains with us to this day. When we think of white supremacy, we picture colored-only signs. But what we should picture is pirate flags. On some level, we've always grasped this. We invoke the words of Jefferson and Lincoln because they say something about our legacy and our traditions. We do this because we recognize our links to the past, at least when they flatter us. But black history does not flatter American democracy. It chastens it. The popular mocking of reparations is a harebrained scheme authored by wild-eyed lefties and intellectually unserious black nationalists is fear, masquerading as laughter. Black nationalists have always perceived something unmentionable about America that integrationists dare not acknowledge. That white supremacy is not merely the work of popular demagogues or a matter of false consciousness, but a force so fundamental to America that it is difficult to imagine the country without it. And so we must imagine a new country. Reparations, by which I mean the full acceptance of our collective biography and its consequences, is the price we must pay to see ourselves squarely. The recovering alcoholic may well have to live with his illness for the rest of his life, but at least he is not living a drunken lie. Reparations beckons us to reject the intoxication of hubris and see America as it is, the work of fallible humans. Won't reparations divide us? Well, not any more than we're already divided. The wealth gap merely puts a number on something we feel but cannot say, that American prosperity was ill-gotten and selective in its distribution. What is needed is an airing of family secrets, a settling with old ghosts. What is needed is the healing of the American psyche and the banishment of white guilt. What I'm talking about is more than recompense for past injustices, more than a handout or a payoff, hush money, or a reluctant bribe. What I'm talking about is a national reckoning that would lead to spiritual renewal. Reparations would mean the end of scarfing hot dogs on the 4th of July while denying the facts of our heritage. Reparations would mean the end of yelling patriotism while waving a Confederate flag. Reparations would mean a revolution of the American consciousness, a reconciling of our self-image as the great democratizer with the facts of our history. We are not the first to be summoned to such a challenge. In 1952, when West Germany began the process of making amends for the Holocaust, it did so under conditions that should be instructive to us. Resistance was violent. Very few Germans believed that Jews were entitled to anything. Only 5% of West Germans surveyed reported feeling guilty about the Holocaust. And only 29% believed that Jews were owed restitution from the German people. The rest, wrote the historian Tony Judd in his 2005 book, Post-War, were divided between those who thought that only people who really committed something were responsible and should pay, which was some 40% of respondents, and those who thought that the Jews themselves were partly responsible for what happened to them during the Third Reich, which was 21% respondents. Germany's unwillingness to squarely face its history went beyond the polls. Movies that suggested a societal responsibility for the Holocaust beyond Hitler were banned. The German soldier fought bravely and honorably for his homeland, claimed President Eisenhower, endorsing the Teutonic national myth. Judd wrote, throughout the 50s, West German officialdom encouraged a comfortable view of the German past, in which the Wehrmacht was heroic while Nazis were in a minority and properly punished. Konrad Adenauer, the post-war German chancellor, was in favor of reparations, but his own party was divided, and he was able to get an agreement passed only with the votes of the Social Democratic opposition. Among the Jews of Israel, reparations provoked violent and venomous reactions, ranging from denunciation to assassination plots. Survivors of the Holocaust feared laundering the reputation of Germany with money and mortgaging the memory of their dead. Beyond that, there was a taste for revenge. My soul would be at rest if I knew there were 6 million German dead to match the 6 million Jews, said Mir Dvorzecki, who had survived the concentration camps of Estonia. West Germany ultimately agreed to pay Israel 3.45 billion Deutschmarks, or more than $7 billion in today's dollars. Individual reparations claims followed for psychological trauma, for offense to Jewish honor, for halting law careers, for life insurance, and for time spent in concentration camps. 17% of funds went towards purchasing ships. By the end of 1961, these reparations vessels constituted 2/3 of the Israeli merchant fleet, writes Israeli historian Tom Segev in his book, The Seventh Million. From 1953 to 1963, the reparations money funded about 1/3 of the total investment in Israel's electrical system, which tripled its capacity and was nearly half the total investment in the railways. Israel's GNP tripled during the 12 years of the agreement. The Bank of Israel attributed 15% of this growth, along with 45,000 jobs, to investments made with reparations money. But Segev argues the impact went far beyond that. Reparations had indisputable psychological and political importance, he writes. Reparations could not make up for the murder perpetrated by the Nazis, but they did launch Germany's reckoning with itself, and perhaps provided a roadmap for how a great civilization might make itself worthy of the name. Assessing the reparations agreement, Prime Minister David Ben-Gurion said, "For the first time in the history of relations between people, a precedent has been created by which a great state, as a result of moral pressure alone, takes it upon itself to pay compensation to the victims of the government that preceded it. For the first time in the history of a people that has been persecuted, oppressed, plundered, and despoiled for hundreds of years in the countries of Europe, a persecutor and despoiler has been obliged to return part of his spoils, and has even undertaken to make collective reparation as partial compensation for material losses. Something more than moral pressure called America to reparations. We cannot escape our history. All of our solutions to the great problems of healthcare, education, housing, and economic inequality are troubled by what must go unspoken. The reason black people are so far behind now is not because of now, Clyde Ross told me. It's because of then. The crime with which reparations activists charge the country implicates more than just a few towns or corporations. The crime indicts the American people themselves at every level and in nearly every configuration. A crime that implicates the entire American people deserves its hearing in the legislative body that represents them. John Conyers' H.R. 40 is a vehicle for that hearing. No one can know what would come out of that debate. Perhaps no number can fully capture the multi-century plunder of black people in America. Perhaps the number is so large that it can't be imagined, let alone calculated and dispensed. But I believe that wrestling publicly with these questions matters as much as, if not more than, the specific answers that might be produced. An America that asks what it owes its most vulnerable citizens is improved and humane. An America that looks away is ignoring not just the sins of the past, but the sins of the present and the certain sins of the future. More important than any single check cut to any African American, the payment of reparations would represent America's maturation out of the childhood myth of its innocence into a wisdom worthy of its founders. And lest we think all this plundering is behind us, in 2010, Jacob S. Rue, and then a doctoral candidate at Princeton, and the sociologist Douglas S. Massey published a study of the recent foreclosure crisis. Among its drivers, they found an old foe: segregation. Black home buyers, even after controlling for factors like creditworthiness, were still more likely than white home buyers to be steered towards subprime loans. Decades of racist housing policies by American government, along with decades of racist housing policies by American businesses, had conspired to concentrate African Americans in the same neighborhoods. As in North Lawndale half a century earlier, these neighborhoods were filled with people who had been cut off from mainstream financial institutions. When subprime lenders went looking for prey, they found black people waiting like ducks in a pen. High levels of market segregation created a natural market for subprime lending, Rue and Massey write, and caused riskier mortgages and thus foreclosures to accumulate disproportionately in racially segregated minority neighborhoods. Plunder in the past made plunder in the present efficient. The banks of America understood this. In 2005, Wells Fargo promoted a series of wealth-building strategies seminars, dubbing itself the nation's leading originator of home loans to ethnic minority customers. The bank enrolled black public figures in an ostensible effort to educate blacks on building generational wealth. But the wealth-building seminars were a front for wealth theft. In 2010, the Justice Department filed a discrimination suit against Wells Fargo, alleging that the bank had shunted blacks into predatory loans regardless of their creditworthiness. This was not magic or coincidence or misfortune. It was racism reifying itself. According to the New York Times, affidavits found loan officers referring to their customers as mud people and to their subprime products as ghetto loans. We just went right after them, Beth Jacobson, a former Wells Fargo loan officer, told the Times. Wells Fargo Mortgage had an emerging markets unit specifically targeting black churches because it figured church leaders had a lot of influence and could convince congregants to take out subprime loans. In 2011, Bank of America agreed to pay $355 million to settle charges of discrimination against its countrywide unit. The following year, Wells Fargo settled its discrimination suit for more than $175 million. But the damage had been done. In 2009, half of the properties in Baltimore, whose owners had been granted loans by Wells Fargo, had been between 2005 and 2008. 2005 and 2008 were vacant. 71% of these properties were in predominantly black neighborhoods. Okay, so that's all I have for today. Like I said, there's a lot that I couldn't get to in the article, and I'd highly recommend checking it out for yourself, along with the supplementary articles that it links to. There's plenty of those. Before we break for group discussion, I'd like to get a sense for how the sentiment in the room has shifted. So by a show of hands, who supports reparations now?
Could you qualify reparations? I mean, define it as to all, the whole class of people, or to people?
However you want to. We can discuss that.
Oh,
in the
okay.
group. Yeah.
This is not a binding vote.
Yeah, not a binding vote. And who opposes reparations? And who's still undecided? Okay, let's discuss.